This is rural America. This is building the national broadband network. And this is what it takes to achieve regulatory compliance. Thus far in the Small Company Coalition's video library, we've explored several topics, including how wired and wireless networks function, as well as funding programs for rural broadband and the need to make them more tamper-proof and sustainable. This video will assume some familiarity with those topics, so if you need a refresher, please check out our previous videos, which will be linked in the description. Now, let's take a look at what it takes to provide internet service in rural and tribal communities. We'll focus mostly on the regulatory aspect of the business, examining the various permitting and licensing hurdles which are required to remain in compliance, both in the initial deployment of broadband infrastructure as well as to keep it running. To get an idea of the challenges that rural ISPs face in building broadband networks in their communities, as well as the steps they must take to complete such a project, I spoke with Jim Myers, CEO of Penasco Valley Telephone Cooperative in New Mexico. I asked him how his company evaluates a given area when considering the feasibility of building broadband networks there.
Usually when we're looking at unserved and underserved areas, they're either outside of our co-op territory or inside. So right now we have quite a few areas that by definition are unserved or underserved because of the broadband definition, as it's changed, where previously it was served, but because of the speeds in the definition of broadband, it became unserved or underserved. And right now, a lot of what we're looking at is what funding is available, to help out with those areas, because we're especially in our co-op territory, so remote, where we're like one person for every 2 square miles. And I think that's probably second to Alaska when you're looking at remoteness there. And in addition to that, our area we serve is extremely rocky. So when it comes to burying fiber, it's difficult. It's a high cost endeavor to bury. So we also have to take into consideration, to save money, who the power company is, whether or not we can work with them to put the fiber on those poles. So those are all things that we're looking at, is what are the costs, what can we afford to do, what money is available right now. There's quite a bit of grants that are available out there, and that's a whole nother process. And being able to understand those grants and what those applications are.
This last consideration regarding grants is rather important, as the mere availability of money allocated to serve a given territory doesn't guarantee that the territory will be served.
I know one of the I guess misunderstandings for a lot of folks out there that are aware of funding, and think that it's just free money for telcos. It doesn't actually work that way. A lot of these are set up as loans. I know a big portion of what we've received now, or that we've been awarded, are loans, or we have to match a certain percentage. And that is something else that has to be taken into consideration, is how that's going to affect cash flow, what you can afford to pay back, with interest, what the timing of all that is. So that's just trying to figure out what is feasible. The terrain, the electrical company you may be working with, what contractors are available. For us, we're limited, with options out here. So that's also something we have to take into consideration, is the timing of who's available to do that. In some cases, we do some of the stuff in-house. We also have to look at what areas that we're going to be crossing, whether it's federal land, state land, Department of Transportation, they all have different requirements when it comes to permitting. And in some cases, what we're running into are folks wanting to charge us per mile also on top of that. And I think maybe that has something to do with thinking there's a lot of money available. So they want to, to get their piece of that too. Before you even put any equipment on the ground out there to put the fiber in, there's a lot of heavy lifting and just trying to remove the roadblocks out of the way to being able to, just get started on getting connectivity out to folks.
As we can see, there are many complex factors involved in a broadband build. Furthermore, if a company is using grant or loan money, there are also time restrictions for when the project must be completed. This is particularly relevant to consider when certain permits may take months or even years to obtain. More on this later. Another challenge that rural and tribal ISPs face is the dynamic nature of each project, where no two builds are exactly the same. The more rural the territory, the more this axiom holds true. In addition to unique geographical challenges in different locations, each build may require different permits, rights of way, working with a different company to procure pole attachment agreements, and much more. Jim noted that some of these obstacles can even result in a build being deemed unfeasible. In other words, even though a company has the resources and the ability to execute the build, the obstacles are so burdensome that a business case cannot be made to build the infrastructure, even with government funding.
For an example, in our co-op territory, there's a big portion of it that's served by an electrical co-op. And when we put our grants together, we used the costs at the time for pole attachments and also make ready costs. And in make ready, that could also include replacing poles that maybe are older or not tall enough. And so we used just industry averages, through our engineering firm, and we got awarded. And then when it came time to do the work, in some cases, those prices came back double or triple what they originally were.
Still, other problems may be encountered when dealing with multiple government agencies. Unfortunately, interagency communication and coordination aren't without wrinkles, and working with one state or federal agency by no means ensures that there won't be roadblocks on that same project when working with another governmental agency. An example of this would be a project which requires permission from the Bureau of Land Management, which typically takes around 2 years to issue a permit. This same project may have received funding from a state or federal agency, and naturally, that funding will come with a deadline for getting the job done. It would be reasonable to assume that the two government agencies would communicate with one another and expedite the permitting process, given that federal funding is being used on the project. However, this is often not the case, and these types of hangups can result in projects not being completed properly or never being undertaken in the first place. Yet another factor to consider is that in some cases, the grant money is taxed. Mr. Myers gave an example of one build where his company was awarded grant money for the project, only to discover later that 25% of that grant money was to be paid in taxes. Incidents such as this offer clear examples where efficiency can be greatly improved simply through better coordination and more common sense policy making among our federal and state agencies. If money is allocated for building broadband networks in rural America, then 100% of that money should go exactly toward that goal. It makes no sense, and is indeed counterproductive, for one government agency to grant money to a broadband provider only to have a portion of that money immediately go back to the government itself. I spoke with Jim about one other common obstacle in broadband builds, which is known as a pole attachment agreement.
Some of the electric companies we work with, now when it comes to make ready, the average amount of poles has gone way up, which seems a little suspect. Where in the past we have a pretty good example of where or how many poles and what it takes on average, when we're going to do attachments. So we call that the make ready, piece to that. And so, to add insult to injury, like we were talking about, the taxes. So theoretically, in some cases, we're replacing all the poles or a big portion of them at our cost. So, whether we're borrowing the money or we've got a grant or something like that to do that. And in a lot of cases, there's a big match, or it's all a loan, and we're purchasing the poles, and they get installed, and then we also have to pay a lease on top of that. So we purchase them, and then and pay for the installation, and then have to pay rent on the pole we just purchased.
Jim further noted that companies are not able to capitalize this expenditure in order to recover the cost. A company can be awarded grant money, and even if that money 100% covers the cost of broadband deployment, it can still be a losing business venture if the recurring revenue generated from the users doesn't cover the cost of maintaining the network. This occurs because most grants only cover capital expenditures and not operating expenses. Operating expenses can become quite significant in areas where storms and other adverse natural conditions are present which damage the network, thus requiring regular maintenance and repairs. Also worth noting is the fact that in many cases, the rural electrical co-ops and the rural ISPs share the exact same customers, so one would think that any such barriers to providing broadband service should be streamlined, if not eliminated. Jim was very clear in stating that these difficulties are not uniform across all ISP electric co-op relationships. He stated that some co-ops are very easy to work with, as some of them charge a quarter of the cost of others, in addition to performing some of the make-ready work on the poles themselves. In short, from the consumer standpoint, as well as that of Congress, whose stated goal is to provide all Americans with high-speed internet, it would be best to streamline the pole attachment process, as well as the costs involved, so that money dedicated to providing broadband service efficiently reaches its intended target. Let's turn now to examine some of the paperwork involved in these projects. I spoke with my father, Jim Kale, president and CEO of Laurel Highland Telephone Company in Donegal, Pennsylvania, about some of the regulatory requirements and filings that must be met as a part of building and maintaining broadband networks in rural America. He noted that there are typically several filings per month which he, as CEO, must verify, stating that the company is in compliance. He stated that it would be a smoother process if there were an annual checklist which the officer of the company could complete once per year with all compliance items listed in the same place at the same time. Furthermore, he spoke about one of the more recent FCC programs, known as the Performance Measures Module, or PMM.
For example, it's performance measurement testing. I've said this many times before. It's time consuming on this part of my staff. It's costly. We pay an outside consultant type for providing service each month. We had to buy equipment. And at the end of the day, all we're accomplishing is saying the customer is getting the speed, the internet speed that we said they're supposed to be getting, what they're paying for.
He went on to state that in rural America, companies have a different relationship with our customers than larger carriers do with their customers in big cities. Here in rural America, our companies are based in the communities that we serve. If they aren't receiving the service they're promised, then they let us know directly. In many cases, they're able to do so in person. None of this is to say that regulatory oversight shouldn't exist. To the contrary, where federal funding is involved, oversight is crucial. However, regulations that are duplicative or unnecessarily onerous should be considered for streamlining or removal, as they are disproportionately costly and burdensome for small rural and tribal carriers. Another such program that may be well-intentioned but runs the risk of becoming more cumbersome than it's worth is the congressionally mandated broadband nutrition labels. Along the same lines as the PMM, the nutrition labels aim to show the consumer exactly what is being provided to them by their ISP. While this is reasonable in theory, the proposals for the information to be included in the labels is far more granular than would be useful for the average consumer. In some cases, the proposed information could even be a security risk for companies and their customers. The FCC, who is charged with carrying out the program under directive from Congress, has sought feedback on whether broadband providers should be required to include information on their cybersecurity practices and whether or not they fall short of established standards. Again, while this may seem reasonable at first glance, from an honest consumer's perspective, it's important to realize that this information would be publicly visible for anyone to see, including bad actors. There's good reason why banks don't advertise their security practices, much less any shortcomings, on the front door of the building. Likewise, this particular proposal, among others, could invoke far more harm than it would any benefits. The PMM and broadband nutrition labels are complex topics, which could easily warrant video essays in their own rights. So rather than delve any further into the details now, let's pull back a bit and take an overview of the topic. Regarding the burden of regulatory compliance and what that means in sheer numbers, the Small Company Coalition compiled a compliance calendar of all federal regulatory filings for small rural carriers in 2017, including the FCC's own estimates for the amount of labor hours required for each. Prior to the 2011 transformation order, this estimated annual average was 677 hours. In 2017, that number reached a staggering 922 labor hours. While these numbers are no longer current, it is our belief that they have only grown since then. In closing, the effort to build and maintain broadband networks in rural and tribal America is a multidisciplinary endeavor. Along with the technical challenges that must be overcome, there is a heavy load of paperwork, compliance, and other red tape that should be viewed with a keen eye for streamlining. As stated previously, funding that is allocated for broadband deployment should be utilized as effectively as possible toward its intended target. Furthermore, obstacles pertaining to permitting, certifications, and intergovernmental coordination must be actively mitigated in order to ensure the most efficient broadband deployment and maintenance possible. Please find links with additional information and sources in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.